just think you're doing such a fabulous job with the Consortium News. You really have brought this front and center, and you got a lot of imaginations. You get the assistance of Elizabeth. You're literally on a full-time basis.
Yeah. On second thought, we'll keep you on for about an hour to keep going on that theme about Consortium News.
Hi, I'm Joe Lauria, Editor-in-Chief of Consortium News. Consortium News was founded in 1995 by the late investigative reporter Robert Perry, who was tired of his stories being suppressed by his editors at the Associated Press and Newsweek. Bob began Consortium News as a place for a consortium of journalists to publish their work that the corporate media wouldn't allow. The website is now approaching its 25th birthday. In that quarter century, the world's first independent news site is dependent on the generous support of its readers. For 25 years, they have given us a vote of confidence by keeping us going. Consortium News remains committed to its core mission, to bring you nonpartisan news and analysis you won't get from a mainstream media that suppresses or misses stories or angles threatening to establishment interests. Consortium News has now moved firmly into the times with the launch last July of CN Live. With just 11 episodes of the webcast so far, CN Live is making its mark on the web with its unique, long-form video journalism that dives deep beneath the surface of the crucial issues of our day. Nat Perry, a son of our founder, said this about CN Live. Congratulations on the CN Live initiative. It looks great, and it's something I'm sure my dad would be pleased with. I know he always wants to do more in terms of video. In both print and on the screen, we've been bringing you the best coverage to be found anywhere about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, as well as incisive analysis of the Middle East, Europe, Asia, domestic U.S. politics, and the media. Bob Perry and many of our writers were in the forefront of debunking the Russiagate conspiracy theory long before it was put to rest by Special Counsel Robert Mueller's failed investigation. But all this takes money, as we pay our writers, editors, and video production and administrative staff. We maintain our fierce independence because we rely only on our readers' and viewers' generosity. So please dig down deep to help support the continuation of Bob Perry's unique project. Consider making a generous contribution during our fall fund drive. Please go to our website, consortiumnews.com, and click on the red donate button on the upper right side of the page. Thank you.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
We're going to be able to contribute some serious money.
Come on, fire.
Major foreign policy tool by the United States, being able to exert universal jurisdiction over borders against non-U.S. citizens and non-U.S. media outlets, and have complete control over the information space internationally.
Get out your notebook. There's more.
Welcome to episode 15 of CN Live. I'm Elizabeth Voss.
And I'm Joe Loria, editor-in-chief of Consortium News.
We devote the entirety of tonight's show to the latest developments about WikiLeaks and its imprisoned publisher, Julian Assange. We will speak to a journalist and two psychologists about the social and personal dynamics of Assange's current plight in a supermax prison. We'll also hear a message to CN Live from legendary journalist, filmmaker, and friend of Assange, John Pilger, who was inside the courtroom for Julian's appearance on Monday. But first, the headlines.
Thursday, the New York Times had a huge scoop. The Justice Department was about to begin a criminal investigation of the Obama Justice Department to see if crimes were committed in the origins of the Russiagate conspiracy theory. The Times immediately framed this story for its readers as an act of political corruption by Trump. It called him obsessed with the origins of a failed operation to take him down. Quote, the opening of the criminal investigation is likely to raise alarms that Mr. Trump is using the Justice Department to go after his perceived enemies, the Times wrote. Are these automatic alarms? Who's raising them? In fact, the Times raised the alarm in what should be a news story, as though it is protecting the potential targets of this criminal investigation on their behalf. Trump should not have become personally involved in this probe, but this doesn't mean there's no need for an investigation into the origins of an operation that, if left unprobed, could be used in the future against other candidates and presidents, even Democratic ones. Elizabeth, I just wanted to ask you to comment for a second on this. I see this issue as not being a partisan one of pro-Trump or against Trump. It's about finding out the facts of a operation that was clearly took liberties. The intelligence agencies, the Justice Department, presumably the FBI, intruded, it appears, into a U.S. democratic election. And this domestic interference into domestic politics by the CIA seems more serious to me than whoever gets elected by the U.S. president. What do you think, Elizabeth?
Well, I agree with that. And I think it's a huge shame that reporting on this one way or the other gets you labeled partisan in some way. I think that we should all be reporting rather than reporting in a way that we think will be correct as to our political leanings. I wish we would just follow the facts and see where they lead. I mean, that's what journalism is supposed to be about, but that really does seem to be forgotten in today's journalism.
Totally agree with you. Yeah. Totally agree.
For the next headline, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson wants a general election on December 12th. If the election is held and if Labour could form a government, it could be good news for Julian Assange, as some Labour leaders said he should not be extradited to the US. Meanwhile, the judge in Assange's extradition process on Monday denied his lawyer's appeal for more time to prepare his case, as the imprisoned WikiLeaks publisher weakly told the court he was unable to research anything in the conditions under which he is being held in high-security Belmarsh prison. Assange appeared in person at Westminster Magistrates Court in London Monday for a case management hearing on the request by the United States for Assange to be sent to Virginia to face 18 charges, including allegedly violating the U.S. Espionage Act for possessing and disseminating classified information that revealed prima facie evidence of U.S. war crimes. Mark Summers, Assange's lawyer, told the court the charges were, quote, a political attempt by the U.S. to, quote, signal to journalists the consequences of publishing information. The Espionage Act indictment against Assange by the Trump administration is the first time that a journalist has been charged under the 1917 Act for publishing classified material. This is part of an avowed war on whistleblowers to include investigative journalists and publishers, Summers said. The American state has been actively engaged in intruding on privileged discussions between Mr. Assange and his lawyer. Because of this surveillance, including unlawful copying of their telephones and computers, as well as, quote, hooded men breaking into offices, end quote, Assange's lawyers needed more time to prepare his defense, Summers argued. But Baritzer refused the request and ordered Assange back in court for a second management hearing on December 19th. The full extradition hearing is scheduled to begin on February 25 next year. As the hearing ended Monday, Baritzer asked Assange if he understood what had just transpired, and he answered, quote, not really, I can't think properly. He added, I don't understand how this is equitable. This superpower had 10 years to prepare for this case, and I can't access my writings. It's very difficult where I am to do anything, but these people have unlimited resources. They are saying journalists and whistleblowers are enemies of the people. They have unfair advantages dealing with documents. They know the interior of my life with my psychologist. They steal my children's DNA. This is not equitable, what is happening here. And that's the end of the quote from Julian Assange.
Legendary journalist, filmmaker, and Assange friend John Pilger, who was in the courtroom for that hearing, could not join us on tonight's program, but he did send the following message to CN Live. The worst moment was one of a number of worst moments. I have sat in many courtrooms and seen judges abuse their positions. This judge, Vanessa Barreza, actually she isn't a judge at all, she's a magistrate, shocked all of us who were there. Her face was a progression of sneers and imperious indifference. She addressed Julian with an arrogance that reminded me of a magistrate presiding over apartheid South Africa's race classification board. When Julian struggled to speak, he couldn't get words out, even stumbling over his name and date of birth. When he spoke truth, and when his barrister spoke, she contrived boredom. When the prosecuting barrister spoke, she was attentive. She, the judge, had nothing to do. It was demonstrably preordained. In the table in front of us were a handful of American officials whose directions to the prosecutor were carried by his junior. Back and forth this young woman went, delivering instructions. The judge watched this outrage without a comment. It reminded me of a newsreel of a show trial in Stalin's Moscow. The difference was that Soviet show trials were broadcast. Here, the state broadcaster, the BBC, blacked it out, as did the other mainstream channels. Having ignored Julian's barrister's factual description of how the CIA had run a Spanish security firm that spied on him in the Ecuadorian embassy, she didn't yawn, but her disinterest was as expressive. She then denied Julian's lawyers any more time to prepare their case, even though their client was prevented in prison from receiving legal documents and other tools with which to defend himself. Her knee in the groin was to announce that the next court hearing would be at remote Woolwich, which adjoins Belmarsh Prison and has few seats for the public. This will ensure isolation and as close to a secret trial as it's possible to get. Did this happen in the home of the Magna Carta? Yes, but who knew?
Pilger continued, writing, quote, Julian's case is often compared with Dreyfus, but historically it's far more important. No one doubts, not his enemies on the New York Times, not the Murdoch press in Australia, that if he is extradited to the United States and the inevitable supermax, journalism will be incarcerated too. Who will then dare to expose anything of importance, let alone the high crimes of the West? Who will dare publish collateral murder? Who will dare tell the public that democracy, such as it is, has been subverted by a corporate authoritarianism from which fascism draws its strength? Once, there were spaces, gaps, bolt holes in mainstream journalism in which mavericks, who are the best journalists, could work. These are long closed now. The hope is the samizdat of the internet, where fine disobedient journalism is still practiced. The greater hope is that a judge or even judges in Britain's Court of Appeal, the High Court, will rediscover justice and set him free. In the meantime, it's our responsibility to fight in ways we know, but which now require more than a modicum of Assange courage.
I'm here with Emmy Butlin, who's just come out of the hearing. Emmy, you're obviously in some distress.
There's people crying in the public land.
How was yourself?
It's like a ghost. He could hardly talk. It's so unfair. The judge wants to transfer the final court of view, the federal one, to Belmarsh Magistrate. To exclude us and the press and everybody, do the dirty dealing and hide it.
Yeah.
He's dying. We've got to do something.
They say democracy dies in darkness. This is the UK judicial system turning out the lights. This man is being tortured for telling the truth. What is going to happen now? Is that deferred to another time? Or?
Yes, he will appear by video link on the
18th of November, video link.
Here, and then the next time, the 19th of December, via video link here.
And that's going to be like two preliminary hearings.
The first one will be an administrative hearing. It will last 5 minutes. The second one will be another case management hearing. Might be a bit longer. This particular hearing was about the timetable. The lawyers for his defence have asked for some more time. evidence for, because there is a case in Spain in front of the Spanish courts where UC Global, the security company employed by Ecuador to guard the embassy, supplied the CIA with live feeds inside the embassy.
The CIA actually had access to UC Global server, and they could even see things like Pamela Anderson. She was filmed going to the toilet. There was no privacy there
And
at
of
all.
course, privileged information between him and his lawyers in the hands of the CIA.
And doctor as well.
And the lawyers were basically today were saying that they need time to get evidence, a huge amount of evidence apparently, of compromising the client-lawyer relationship. And so, very, very difficult situation. But the thing that breaks my heart is here you have an intellectual, a gentle soul, being brutalized. And you see how he looks. How is he going to make it? How is he going to make it the next year, the year after? And people crushing him for years.
We are now joined from the UK by Patrick Henningsen, coming to us from Great Britain. Patrick, welcome to CN Live.
Great to be with you, Joe. Great to be with you, Elizabeth.
Patrick is the editor of 21st Century Wire, one of the must-read alternative sites out there. Patrick's been plugged into the case of Julian Assange from a long time back. He was previously inside the courtroom and then outside when the last time Julian appeared. He did not go in this week, but he has a keen eye to what's happening. So, Patrick, what do you think were the main takeaways from that appearance in the courtroom on Monday with Julian Assange?
I thought it was really interesting. It seemed to be, in many ways, a repeat of the previous hearings. This was a case schedule hearing, so what it was designed to do was to lay out the schedule for the coming 10 weeks or so, the coming 3 months, and that both sides would agree on a schedule and when they were going to present what and so forth. And then when the hearing, the most important thing probably from the Assange defense side is when the hearing was going to begin, because obviously they're up against the clock in terms of the time. And the arguments that were put forth, maybe not convincingly enough or not enough to convince this judge, was that Julian Assange has not been granted adequate time, materials, access to his legal team, etc., in order to prepare for his defense. What makes this most shocking, really, is if you think of the gravity of this case as a precedent case, that it will affect the press, free press, free speech, international jurisdiction issues, all of these things. How can you not have enough time to prepare for something with that amount of importance globally? It's just unbelievable. And even if those cards were stacked against Assange, which clearly they are, and of course the state's making no bones about that, still, at least to give the appearance of reciprocity or fair play in this case, that they can prepare a defense. I mean, the British state and the American state would look a whole lot better if they would be at least seen to be playing fair at this stage. But this shows you the level of the authoritarian sort of aspect of it. They don't care. You're not going to get a day extra to prep for this. It's unbelievable.
Well, this is just such a transparently unfair process that you say they would look better if they actually at least went through the motions. First of all, the guy's in a high security, high max prison where violent criminals, he's not accused of a violent crime. He's there. He served his time already for that bail jumping. Again, another nonviolent crime. And now he's being held simply on remand until the extradition request is adjudicated. There's no reason he should be in that prison. That is so obvious right there. It's unfair. Number two, people's accounts from inside the courtroom was that this judge, her face lit up whenever the American lawyers said something, and she gave a lot of attention, and sort of just condescendingly looked at Julian's defense team and Julian himself. You say that they could look better if they pretended, but you know what? It's the press. The mainstream media is not seeing it the way you see it, Patrick, the way we see it. They are not calling this out as the incredibly unfair process that it is, right? This is the issue. That's why they get away with it, in my opinion. because they've got the
Yeah,
cover
no,
of media.
I think we can resign ourselves to the fact that the press does not consider Julian Assange as a colleague. Uh, they don't. He's been completely reframed away from being a journalist or publisher or anything like that to being, cyber criminal, sex criminal, etc. And WikiLeaks has been reframed not to be a media outlet, not to be a publisher, but to be some sort of rogue, reckless uh, outlet that's publishing classified information illegally and so forth, and they need to be brought to heel. That's how it's been reframed. So that this is why you're not going to get any pushback or coverage, for that matter, from the press, and they're so disinterested in this case, because in their minds, and this goes right to the top of the Guardian, Catherine Viner, all the way down. They don't see this as affecting them at all. If you can believe that, that's quite an amazing thing. If you think about that, and ditto for Dean Baquet at the New York Times, and whoever's the editor of the Washington Post these days. I mean, all the majors should be absolutely honed in on this case, like every aspect of it. They should be just pulling it apart, looking at the minutia of it. That's how important it is to press media, but not only that, for digital publishing going forward in the 21st century, and for U.S. foreign policy, because this is a major foreign policy tool by the United States, being able to exert universal jurisdiction over borders against non-U.S. citizens and non-U.S. media outlets, and have just complete control over the information space internationally with the long arm of the Department of Justice. I mean, it's and probably threatening countries with sanctions if they don't comply or give up said perpetrator who's been indicted. I mean, that's what you're looking at going forward. And so that's one thing. I mean, the other thing is that the press is absolutely derelict in the reporting of all of the steps that have come right up to this point, this last hearing. Julian Assange is being held as a Category A prisoner, not officially, but he's being treated exactly as a Category A violent criminal, violent felon in Belmarsh prison, and he's unconvicted. So he's being indefinitely detained. He's unconvicted. He served his time, whether you agree or not with the bail skipping charge. It's done. And he's still being held under an extradition order. And they've said because he's in danger of absconding. This is the words prosecutors have used. And that's not the case either. That, again, that's more reframing, because he sought asylum in the Ecuadorian embassy, which is his human right. That is everyone's right, political asylum, according to many different conventions, internationally agreed treaties. Okay, this isn't just a flight of fancy, like, oh, I think I might be under threat of some other crime, or I'm running from the law, so I'm going to accept political asylum. Ecuador didn't do that casually. That was considered, and they probably went through quite a few administrative processes with the Ecuadorian government to make sure that that was a good move for them as a state, because he was a high-profile fugitive, as it were, at that time from the British justice system. But, bail skipping charges, I don't even want to get into that, but the majority of people, even with no priors, to be thrown in a Belmarsh prison on a bail skipping charge, it doesn't even follow through with the majority of people who have skipped bail in the UK in the last few years. You can just look at the records. We published a legal analysis on all of these points at 21st Century Wire by Nina Cross, who's been working very hard on this case. And so even in the prison service's own directives, I think it's clause 6400. I don't have the exact name of the clause, but it's on our article on 21st Century Wire that specifically states what a non-category A prisoner, an unconvicted, somebody who's waiting, should have full access, as many visits as they want. They should have a computer. They should be able to have telephone access, unlimited legal representative meetings, etc., and so forth. And they're in their own clothes. They should be able to conduct day-to-day businesses. In other words, if somebody has a business outside of prison, if they were, an unconvicted, non-category A prisoner on whatever he's being held on right now, he should have almost complete freedom other than movement if he's being detained according to the prison system own directives. So there's a double standard at play. He's being treated very differently. He's being treated like a terrorist That's no exaggeration. And so that's a wrong. And on that basis alone, his defense team has an incredibly strong argument that this is a miscarriage of justice. There's no doubt about it. You can't, there's no argument that the state can make to say that he's being treated fairly or equitably. And even his own words, it was sad to hear him plea for equity when he was given a chance to speak in the last hearing. I mean, he's right. Everything he said is absolutely correct about how the United States has unlimited resources, unlimited time, 10 years to prepare a case, and he's not even been given the minimum, not even the minimum under his rights in the justice system in Britain. It's incredible.
Do you know if his lawyers have filed a motion about that he's not being held according to the law, that it should be an open and shut case right there, that decision?
I don't know. I don't know if they have or not. I mean, that's probably a question that you could put to
I hope
somebody
that
maybe
they have.
closer to his legal team.
You're absolutely right. That's a line that they have to take, obviously. You know, Marty Baron, by the way, is the editor of the Washington Post. And I bring that up again because you made an interesting comment about the Viner at the Guardian and Barron and Beckett at the Times. They don't feel personally threatened by this. They're not, so they don't care. But this is not how journalists are supposed to think about what's good for me. They have a public, they have a readership that they're supposed to be serving. This is important for the public to know about what's going on here, not whether it affects their careers or not. And that's an unbelievable indictment you made of them, and I don't doubt that that's part of their motivation, but I think it goes it's worse than that. They are serving the state, the interests of the state. And this guy cannot be allowed to get away with uncovering crimes of the state. They are there to protect the powerful interests. They see themselves as aligned with those powerful interests. This is even a greater indictment of the media, isn't it?
The indictment of the press, I'll go even further than that, Joe, that the corporate media, and that includes state corporations like the BBC, the corporate media are no longer press. They don't serve that function anymore. They are PR. They do public relations for other corporations and for the state. Their loyalty is not to finding the truth or following where the facts take them, where the evidence take them. Their loyalty is to that statement that's issued by a government agency or by a corporation, and say that's it. And there's protesters out on the street, and well, how many protesters are out in the street? That's about as far as it goes. So yeah, I mean, we can drag the press over the coals, but the other thing is this case has taken an interesting turn, and the Spanish media outlet El País has reported something that should have been a game changer really at the end of September, which is that the U.S. government, the CIA, effectively subcontracted this private security company who was originally contracted by the Ecuadorian government to provide security for the Ecuadorian embassy there in London. And then they were double dipping with the CIA. They were running security and being paid by them, and to spy on Julian Assange, his family, his friends, etc. So immediately that reframes this whole, that story, because what it does is that kind of proves that this is a political persecution. Of course, the U.S.'s argument is that it's a criminal offense that Julian Assange has done, and they have stacks and stacks of indictments to try to convince the public that it's a criminal offense. When in fact, when you look at, any judge should be able to look at that new evidence that would be submitted, that this is a political targeting. He's a political prisoner, therefore he cannot be extradited to the United States according to the treaty between Britain and the United States. Article 4 of the extradition treaty specifically prohibits extradition on the basis of being a political prisoner or a political offense. So I think that's pretty clear. And you could make that argument before the El País revelation, but I think now you can absolutely make it's a prima facie argument now. There's no question about it. And I don't know whether the judge is going to recognize that or not. I mean, you got the situation where one judge is going to decide the future of press, media, asylum law, extradition law. It's coming down to what the whims of one person. I don't know. That's the way I
There's one
look at it.
other important thing in that El Pais story is that the CIA got videos of him talking with his lawyers, his psychologists, his doctors, every visitor, except Paul Manafort, by the way. Where's that video? That's the one I want to see.
Those are the secret tapes. Only Luke Harding has those
Oh,
tapes.
only Luke has them. That's
that's
right.
on a need-to-know basis.
Right. Okay. Thanks for explaining that, Patrick. This guy wrote a book called Collusion. That was the title. It was a #1 bestseller in the New York Times. The Mueller investigation found no collusion. He went out on a tremendous limb. His reputation was on the line. He had to grab that absolute bullshit story of Paul Manafort going in there. I'm just saying that if they have the tapes of every visitor, they've got that one. And if they really cared about Luke Harding, the CIA would release that one. But I want to get back to the more serious issue here, which is the attorney-client privilege was violated there. When you've got the government that is trying to get him extradited, that wants to prosecute him, that very same government has listened in on his conversations with his lawyers. This should be immediately thrown out. But one problem is they don't have all the evidence yet from the Spanish investigation. So WikiLeaks was arguing to lawyers that they wanted an extension of the hearing phase. It's beginning in February 25, so they could get that evidence, so they can make a motion to have it thrown out. And the judge won't give them that extension, correct?
Right. That's a big problem. I think the state has exposed itself by not granting an extension on that basis or for the other reasons I mentioned previously. But I think they've really exposed themselves here. I think this is being handled very poorly. And I know that might sound like a cliche, but it's being handled surprisingly very poorly and very ham-fisted by the U.S., but also by the British justice system as well. I mean, the U.S. has no case. The U.S. has no case. And I think the proof of that is the fact that they're putting Chelsea Manning on lockdown and fining her whatever, $1,000 a day. And Jeremy Hammond, they're fishing for someone to turn state's evidence against Assange. That's all they're doing. This is like a bad mob film, with the FBI witness protection program, or, it's a bad film. They have no case. If they had a case, they wouldn't need to do any of that. In fact, there's so much discovery that came out in the Manning case already, and it's 10 years old. I mean, if it's not there, it's not there. What are they doing? I think they're really desperate to really nail it, and they don't have it. And I think a lot of people are starting to recognize that now. And I don't know where this is going to end up, but that could work in Julian Assange's favor later, perhaps. I don't know. But there's a number of problems with the extradition itself. That's going to send a very bad message to the world about British justice. And I don't care what the U.S. claims it has or how many indictments the DOJ has typed out. It's going to send a very bad message about what British values are internationally to the rest of the world, because Britain still it has to maintain a higher ethical standard than the United States. A lot of people have written off the U.S. as a kind of a lawless, imperialist power globally, but not Britain. And this is a big, big problem. I don't know. I just don't, to collude with the U.S. on that level. I can't see how that's going to benefit the UK in the public relations terms. It's really diplomatic terms.
From my perspective, it seems like they don't care. It doesn't seem to me that, from what we've seen, that they have any sense of propriety in the way that they're doing this. As you and Joe both mentioned earlier, if they cared about that as a priority, they would have been doing this in a way that even had a semblance of fairness. And that brings me to a question I wanted to ask you, which was, given the proceedings that you've witnessed yourself and given the proceedings that we have heard about on Monday and seen reported, what does this tell us about the way that the extradition process is going to go? I mean, personally, myself, it seems to me that this tells us that this is going to go through almost immediately with almost no pause whatsoever, without even so much as blinking at it. Is that your take as well? And what is your perspective on how it will
That's what it looks like right now. It absolutely looks like that. It looks like it's just everything's being rubber stamped and waved through all the way through. And to have Americans coming into British courts or representatives of America coming into British courts and just saying that's the law according to Washington, that's reality according to Washington, and just have the judge sit there and nod and say, yes, okay, fine, next. That's basically what it was that I witnessed there. So, but here's the problem. The problem is we're having this argument and we're pulling hair out about this. But and I always said this is an important thing: is that courts don't exist. It's not a vacuum of reality. What happens outside the court matters. And so public opinion matters. It does affect the way judges rule on things. And the fact that the press is not engaged and the press is not involved, as Joe was mentioning before, this is really important. And this is why you were not seeing justice. I really think that you cannot have a functioning democratic society or public or whatever, unless you have a functioning fourth estate. If you don't have a functioning fourth estate, everything breaks down. That's one of the most important checks and balances. And I think that's one of the fundamental core realizations of this story in this case, is we're seeing it on so many levels, not just the persecution of Julian Assange, the man, and WikiLeaks as the media outlet, but you're seeing also the complete just abandonment of this story and what it means, and the injustices and the miscarriage of justices by the larger media, the industry. And that, so the public opinion won't be activated. Therefore, the public pressure won't be activated. Therefore, what happens inside the courtroom will just carry on without any consequences whatsoever. Because that's the only reason why a judge would rule differently, or that the system would act differently if they felt that it was going to basically cause a crisis of public confidence in the institution. That's not happening.
That's such an important point. It's such a complete breakdown. And I think that it is really important to remember, if it wasn't somebody, one single Rutley cameraman chasing down the transport vehicle that Assange was in, we wouldn't have a single image of him from Monday. I mean, it's, you can't say it's intentional collusion to cover up the case, but it does seem that there has been a really conscious lack of interest, as you're saying, by the media that is definitely allowing this to continue. I know that you weren't in the courtroom on Monday, but going from the reports we do have about what was said and the way that Assange spoke and the fact that he seemed to have trouble speaking, do you have any comment on that and differences between the proceedings that you did witness yourself earlier?
Yeah, I'm sad I wasn't there, but I couldn't be for this occasion. But having read the transcripts of what was said during the hearing, I don't care what anybody says, and how brilliant Julian Assange is, and how resilient he is, and he's all of those things clearly to have survived so far. But it does take its toll. Solitary confinement, being restricted to communicate with people or to have intellectual conversations, or to eat the right food, or just being trapped and being imprisoned for somebody that values their liberty and freedom so much as Assange does. It's going to have a physical and mental and psychological toll that's going to be taken on him over years. It's just going to grind down the individual to the point where you're not going to be able to function like normal, and possibly worse. And I think we're starting to see that. That's very worrying. That's a very real problem. It's a very real situation. And especially in his case, this is a major political voice. This is a major dissident voice in society, in Western society. It's not just anybody. He's an intellectual. He's a journalist. He plays an important role in society. So to see him not 100% or not 50%, and maybe going downhill because of the way he's being treated by the justice system is very concerning. Very concerning. I'm sure his family's horrified, without a doubt.
He was able to wave back, apparently, to his supporters who were in the gallery. Is encouraging. He can recognize that there. I remember seeing some of his last TV interviews from inside the embassy, and I could already tell that he was having a hard time with his train of thought. from having seen him over the years. He never had a problem like that. So that was already disturbing. But to see him now deteriorated like this, I'm a little bit hesitant, but I want to raise this issue. It's complete speculation. When it came out, we at Conservative News decided not to write anything about it, not to mention it. And I still think we're not going to put anything in print about it, but I just want to throw it out there. And that was, well, I had the feeling that they wanted their hands. I mean, the British and American intelligence services wanted their hands on this guy since the very beginning, since 2006. Now they finally got him. I mean, this is a huge prize that Ecuador was sitting on, which is why I also said from the beginning that they were going to try to get something from the U.S. in exchange for him. They're not going to give him up. So now they've got him, and they clearly want to go after people around him and indict other people if they can. That could also be part of why they're holding on. Certainly Hammond and maybe even Chelsea. So this is not just about Julian. That's really dangerous. They want to destroy the organization. They don't want to just get him. So I thought if they got their hands on him, they're going to want to interrogate him to get what they can from him. Now, they're not going to wait till he's extradited a year or two later and then he comes to Washington. They're not following procedures. They're going to try to. But I asked John Pilger, who visited him, and he and others have said there's no information or evidence at all that he's been interrogated. That could have been done without his lawyers present, which would probably be the case. So I just wanted to ask you about that. And then the story that was controversial, that I still don't buy, but there's the idea that he may be given some kind of truth serum, that when his questioning is over, he would have no memory of it. So that there's no evidence that he could have been interrogated. Because it does seem like they wouldn't mind if he did not come out of that prison, Patrick. They would avoid the media circus that will go around him here in the U.S. if he comes here to Alexandria. The fact that this will be controversial, it's controversial in Britain, and even more so. So it might be, if they got what they needed from him, it might be better if he doesn't walk out of there to avoid this entire mess. This is just a thought I had. What do you think?
That should be a concern for everybody, that the most convenient outcome for all the belligerent parties, say belligerent, I might sound biased there, but that's the word I'll use. For all the belligerent parties, the most convenient outcome is that he doesn't walk out of Belmarsh prison. And that would get everybody off the hook. It would get Britain off the hook. It would get the U.S. off the hook. It would get Sweden off the hook. And it would get the Moreno government off the hook as
and
well
the press
for selling him out. So that's a problem that is very real, and he could be under a major health challenge for a number of reasons. The people tossed around the theory that he's been administered BZ, narcotic or opiate, whatever. And I've seen that claim made by an American woman, former Air Force doctor or something. Now, there's no evidence to prove that. And but like you said, he is a high value national security target for the U.S., for the Five Eyes alliance countries, and they would be in all their interests to share intelligence that would be able to compromise WikiLeaks, for instance. That would be the most important thing, is how to disable WikiLeaks, and physically to disable it as an outlet, or break it up, or sabotage it, or something like that.
I don't think they'd want him to die until they've gotten the information out of him that they need. That's the quandary there that I can't resolve. I also don't buy that. There's no evidence that he was given this drug. I'm just speculating here. If he does die and they don't care to keep him alive, it means they probably have interrogated him in some way.
I couldn't say. I don't know.
Yeah.
About that. But let's just say, for argument's sake, that he hasn't been interrogated. Then it's from a political point of view. You look at other high-value detainees, and it's 100% better for the state not to have to answer, or for them not to be doing speaking tours after they've been released. Or imagine Chelsea Manning going on a speaking tour right now. Imagine Julian Assange going on a world tour after he's been acquitted. I mean, it'll be devastating. It'll be devastating for the Obama administration, for the Trump administration, for the British government, for Sweden, for Ecuador. I mean, so I think that's more of a priority for them now, even than the technical concerns they might have about WikiLeaks and its system and its organization. Politically, it would be very bad for the Western intelligence alliance and states. And plus, they've already dug themselves a huge hole. They've tripled down on this situation already, to the point where it's clearly a miscarriage of justice for anybody that's paid attention. And they're banking on the fact that not many people are paying attention. They can sort of carry on and get away with this. But also, the other reason why there's a motivation that he wouldn't walk out of there is the U.S. I personally believe that they do not want to put the 1917 Espionage Act to the test on anything that could be considered journalism or media, and they have done before. They've arrested and incarcerated Eugene Debs for making an anti-war speech. They have gone after people politically under the Espionage Act in U.S. history, but those were different times, and this is a different case.
And it was about the draft. It was about the draft. They went after publication like the masses in 1919, I believe, but that was because they opposed the draft in World War One. Never has a journalist been charged under the Espionage Act before now for simply possessing and disseminating classified information. That never happened before. And that's the part of the act that should be challenged all the way to the Supreme Court. Not that I have faith in the Supreme Court, but that clearly bumps up against the First Amendment. But it's still on the books. That's why they are charging him under that. And you're right, they wouldn't necessarily want that to go to trial here, because his lawyers would make that appeal, make an issue of that anyway, and it could get public support. That kind of just on that point.
It will absolutely get, once that button is pushed, it will become an issue, especially in the United States. And the ACLU and everybody, they have people queued up who would be dying to get involved in this case from a legal point of view, just for a number of reasons, if not to go up against the Trump administration and the Trump DOJ. There's plenty of people on the left that would like nothing more than to have that opportunity. But from an international perspective, there's more than just the Espionage Act here. There's all of these things, the abrogation of international treaties that protect people on asylum, taking his citizenship away, which Ecuador did, political prosecutions, which clearly the collusion between Sweden and the UK, it's clear as day. They colluded in order to keep him on ice, as it were, to give the US enough time to do what it wanted to do, to create their case. So all these countries have been working together. That's very clear. So internationally, we have another problem here, which is that, does international law apply? Do international treaties apply? And the current administration, and the Obama administration was the same. The Obama administration was realism light. Here you have more of a hard realism with the Trump administration, where international law does not apply to, it only applies where we say it applies. And why? Because we're stronger as a power and we have more leverage. And I'm talking about the U.S. Treasury Department as a new weapon of war internationally with sanctions. And so that's how America's dictating policy right now, is through the U.S. Treasury Department, through OFAC. And so they're ignoring, so the liberal internationalists who should be pulling their hair out, thinking, why aren't we recognizing or respecting all of these international conventions and treaties? Where are the Samantha Powers of the world arguing this case? Where are the Susan Rices of the world? All these great political, legal minds, supposedly on the liberal left, with foreign policy and so forth, human rights. Where are they all? They've all run. They're nowhere to be found. Nobody from that class, a political class of American leftists, so-called leftists, as you said previously, Joe, I know you made comments about how the Clinton administration moved the Democratic Party, right past the center into the right wing. So, but that aside, where are these people arguing for what is clearly, this is the open goal of all open goals, to take out the Trump administration on a matter of principle, because he's planning to lay waste to the First Amendment of the United States. I mean, there's no bigger there's no bigger open goal in political terms right now than the one that's sitting there with this case.
That's a
But they won't.
complicated question for Susan Rice and Samantha Power. Two women I know very well because I interact with them all the time at the UN.
Yeah.
And
So-
I never had a lot of respect for Samantha Power at all, I'll tell you that. Rice has something. They are not going to go forward on this to support, even though it would be a great attack on the Trump administration, because they believe Julian's role in the 2016 election was to give us Trump. So why, if that's the case, why is Trump going after him, by the way? He should be kissing his feet, not indicting him.
I think from a political point of view, Donald Trump was so traumatized probably by to have Russiagate in the rearview mirror. He's probably just relieved he doesn't want to go back in there and be accused of where it was in 2017, basically, which must have been horrific. It was a minute by minute attack for months on end. So maybe he's just afraid of, he's that cloud's still hanging over his head in the background. But I think the reason the Powers and the Rices of the world, and those are just two examples. I mean, there's many other people that you could put in that group of Barack Obama, the constitutional scholar from Harvard University. I'll put him in that category as well. They're protecting the permanent state in the United States. They're protecting the empire, as it were, from the left side. Forget about the 2016 elections. It's what Assange and WikiLeaks represent in terms of having an independent media outlet floating out in cyberspace who could receive leaks of classified documents showing war crimes by U.S. agencies or soldiers. I mean, that challenges the authority and the credibility of the world superpower globally. And there's no way to control it. And how do we keep a lid on that? It's that even overrides even the concerns, the political concerns of the 2016 election. But the 2016 election is obviously a big roadblock that's been thrown in front of this case that's kept the left from pursuing the Trump administration on this, which is sad. And it shows you how shallow American politics has gotten, that they'll even throw away the most valuable aspect of the US Constitution, which is the First Amendment. Like I said, without a free press, without the protection of speech and press, the whole system becomes dysfunctional. And that's what you'll see more of in America if they pursue this all the way down the line.
Obviously, the prosecution of Assange right now has nothing to do with 2016, has nothing to do with Russiagate at all. And yet that still seems, as you're saying, that still is a cloud that's hanging over this whole proceeding. We still have The Guardian not withdrawing its bogus article about Manafort, as Joe referenced earlier. To what extent do you think this case has been disentangled or not from Russiagate, from those lies that the media hawked for 2+ straight years? To what extent do you think people have really conflated Russiagate with the current proceedings against Assange?
Joe or Consortium News could probably tell anybody better than anyone could of how flimsy and thin the whole Russian hacking story is with WikiLeaks, and to try to pin that on WikiLeaks and Assange for basically being a go-between between the Kremlin and the Trump campaign to give Donald Trump his liftoff into office. It collapses very quickly when you look at it. I think politically, I think a stronger factor with the lack of left-wing support or progressive support for Assange was really the whole framing of him as a sex criminal, because that's I think by orders of magnitude much more important and more powerful in keeping people from supporting him for fear of what the social studies calls, I forgot the term for it, but public approval or something, social acceptability factor. If you support somebody who's been framed as a sex criminal, then social desirability goes right down down the drain. So this is what they've done to divide. They pit the feminists against him. The progressive left in general, no support at all, out of fear. And still people today I run into, and we talk about this case, and they said, but he was a rapist, and he was this and that. That's still imprinted in people's heads. And I think that's the most powerful deterrent for supporting this case, this man, this cause, was that. And you can say the same thing about how they engineered military interventions post-Iraq was done exactly the same way. I gave a presentation, a seminar about this at a university recently, of how meticulous the propaganda was in order to peel off certain sections of the anti-war left. With Libya, for instance, Susan Rice playing a pivotal role in that by pushing out the story of Gaddafi issuing Viagra to his troops to commit mass rape. That was Susan Rice, by the way, who helped to launch that talking point.
She gave that briefing in a closed-door Security Council meeting. I was outside, and then she had her minions come out and leak it. That's how it got into the public. It was a private meeting, and then it was leaked to the press.
And that was really important, because immediately that story transformed. It broke up the anti-war left immediately, took a section right off. And in Syria, they did a bunch of other examples of that. The gay girl of Damascus hoax, and etc. There's so many of those that to divide. And Putin's targeting gays and hunting gays down in Moscow, and Assad's doing the same. So the LGBT lobby were immediately pro-regime change and pro-proxy war for Syria because of that. And so I'm just giving an example how powerful identity politics is in terms of managing the herd, as it were, of public support for and against. And I think that's been the biggest factor by the establishment, was able to turn the left, who feted Julian Assange. The liberal intelligentsia were, everyone wanted to get a bit of his stardust back in the day, back in 2008, 9, 10. There were queues of people, thousands of people coming to see him when he spoke, or at these conferences and panel discussions. And he was a rock star on the left.
And that was after he supposedly committed the crimes he's being charged with.
That's correct.
But he was exposing the Bush administration. This is a partisan thing all the way through.
There you go,
Once
Joe.
he heard Hillary, they want this guy
persona non grata.
Ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, they wanted him even before he hurt Hillary, but that was the knockout punch, was the 2016 election for him in this round. But you're right, Joe. When he opposed the Bush administration, when the anti-war left was cohesive, he was a hero, and he was protected by people in the press and the Guardian and liberal members of the press. And not anymore. That to me is the story within the story. If I was to write a history, historical review of this and how it transforms society, that's one of the most important pieces of that story. Is that process.
One of the things that would really back up what you're saying is Nils Meltzer's report, and the way that he really focuses in on that rape narrative and dismantling it very carefully, very methodically, and showing how it was the collusion of these multiple states to tar Assange that really led to that and reinforced it. So yeah, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. But I guess to ask my earlier question more precisely, it's that I guess what I see when I talk to people, in addition to that exact response that you described, where people go, oh, but the rape story, is that people also still think that he's actually being somehow prosecuted for Russia. I mean, it's so absolutely disconnected from reality that it shocks me. But to what extent do you see people actually conflating his current prosecution at the extradition request with Russiagate, with 2016? Because I still see that amongst the public.
I think more in America, you'll see that. Whereas in Britain, it's definitely sex crime. That's the kind of overriding narrative here. A lot of people still think that he was a fugitive from the Swedish government for rape charges. And so they did a really good job in sort of, burning that into the minds of the public. in Britain and probably in Europe in general. Someone came up to me once recently and they said, is he still in there? Is he still in Belmarsh? They don't even know where he's being held. So it just shows you how there's a lack of interest here. And this goes back to our original point. I know it's obvious, but if it's not in the papers, if it's not on mainstream media, as powerful as alternative media is, we have a certain amount of reach collectively, all of these different independent media outlets and commentators and social media personalities, but the mainstream press, it gives it that sort of critical mass where it could actually, go one way or the other in history. And that hasn't happened in this case. It's so submerged. And so the numbers of people you see, although when Roger Waters played outside the Home Office in London, I was there at that gathering, and there was, a few thousand people out there. So that was the largest gathering in support of Julian Assange. I mean, those are numbers that are coming close to where he was at the peak of his fame on the liberal left, but it's a totally different crowd now, a totally different coalition of supporters than before. And it's not safe to support Julian Assange and WikiLeaks now as it was back then. It was, trendy back then to be at the frontline club and all of this other stuff. But now it's much more of a risky thing to do. So the types of people that are very committed, I think the people that will come out and support him now are extremely committed. They understand what's at stake. It's definitely growing. The awareness is definitely growing. The commitment, the seriousness of a lot of the people is growing as well. So I think I'm still positive that something's going to break. I'm very hopeful because I've seen the support increase incrementally since the spring. So the level of public awareness is much better, much higher. It's a very confusing political environment right now, domestically, politically in the U.S. and Europe and internationally, with Trump and Brexit and so forth, and all of the things going on in the Middle East and beyond. It's a very complex and confusing environment right now. For people to find space for this Julian Assange WikiLeaks issue is a challenge for a lot of people. But I think it's there. I don't think critical mass. It's not going to take as much as you might think to achieve critical mass in this case. I think it'd be a much smaller percentage of people, but active and highly aware politically can make a huge difference and could apply that amount of pressure that's needed for the judiciary to think twice about how they're going to rule on this in February. I really think so.
Well, Patrick, we hope you're right. It's hard to be optimistic, but there is a way, I suppose, especially in the face of what Elizabeth was saying, the smearing of him, not only on the sexual issues, but here in the U.S. on Russiagate, that this people probably, if you went into the street here, and I asked 10 people here in Alexandria, Virginia, where they want to bring him, and maybe 8 of them would say, well, because he worked for the Russians. I think that they think that this is what this is about. I'm just guessing, but that is, again, the failure of the media to explain the case properly has allowed that misconception. Patrick, it's terrific to hear from you again, and we'll have you back on, hopefully, to continue to talk about this as this case continues to unfold. So that was Patrick Henningsen from United Kingdom. Bye-bye. You're watching CN Live on Consortium News. I'm Joe Loria.
And I'm Elizabeth Voss. Join us every Friday from 8 to 10 Eastern Time.
We're streaming through consortiumnews.com.
And on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and DLive.
CN Live.
Your weekly insight into the news.
To talk about Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, we're joined from the San Francisco Bay Area by Nozomi Hayase. Naomi has actually done a PhD on WikiLeaks, so she's somewhat of an expert. Tell us a little more about your background, how you got so fixated on the issue of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange.
My PhD is based on a psychology, branch of psychology called liberation psychology, which is to really analyzes the structure of power and how the force of oppression affect us psychologically. So while I was at the graduate school studying about the social issue of social justice and historical colonization, WikiLeaks basically came to a public limelight in 2010. So then that changed my whole entire course of academic life, that I got very much interested in finding out what this organization is trying to accomplish in the world. And so ever since then, I started to follow. Basically, first I was interested in how WikiLeaks became so effective, because it really changed the media landscape in a dramatic way. But what in particular interested me was the coordinated attack that came from the United States government that purported, supposed to stand up for free speech, and the disinformation about WikiLeaks and then the false narrative about what this organization has been doing. So then I started to write. I, basically became a journalist, and my purpose was to dismantle false narratives that come from the mainstream media. So then, after 10 years later, here I am. I just got deeply involved in defending WikiLeaks and now Julian Assange.
Well, that's certainly one way to define WikiLeaks, that they dismantle a lot of false narratives in the corporate media. More and more, it appears that the media, the way I'm looking at it now, having worked in it and studied it myself, that they seem to be laundering this information from the intelligence agencies. If the CIA spoke directly to the public, and they're doing that now too, when these former CIA guys join as commentators, but if they just sent messages directly to the public, I don't know if the public would believe them, but if you launder it through the New York Times or the CNN, it gains credibility with the public. And look how they are destroying the reputation of Julian Assange.
And then for me, I must say one thing. I come from academia, and I was studying about the history of colonization and oppression that has happened in the past, And when WikiLeaks rose in 2010, it was just history was just set in motion, that I was able to see, the oppression that is happening, and that there's a way for me to engage in actually changing a course of history. So it was such a profoundly transformative experience for me, that I was able to, put my academic knowledge into action through defending this organization.
One of the most important stories that you've written over the years, in which you used releases of WikiLeaks to change the story that was being told by corporate media.
I think the publication of the Colorado Matter video, that really, it was the beginning, and I think it's really changed the way we look at the world, and also, especially for Americans, I think it's really cuts through this collective amnesia that we have as a culture about genocide of natives and the historic denial of what has been taking place on this soil, and how this is still being enacted overseas in the Middle East. This, and then there have been scholars, there have been journalists who were, trying to tell us about this untold history, and they have been discredited because they didn't have evidence, because they could not provide raw material in the way that WikiLeaks had provided. So to see that visceral image of, the state of uncensored state of modern war was exceptionally powerful. And I think it's really, I think we have not really understood the profound effect it has had to American psyche, so that we are still suffering from collective amnesia, but something happened in our memory, something started to happen. And, and then now people are, we have been so much distracted from the actual publication that WikiLeaks released because of this US government's attack on Julian Assange and WikiLeaks. But we have to understand, what WikiLeaks has done is significant for Americans, and why we have to defend Julian Assange and WikiLeaks.
To what extent has your work been accepted or rejected by your academic peers, and to what extent has it sort of kind of seeped into their consciousness and been either reflected or absorbed into their work?
I think that I personally find that there is hesitance on the part of people who are in the academia to touch events that are happening right now. So, I mean, I worked with good professors, but some of them had a resistance to look at the wars that their government are still engaged in, such as war in Afghanistan and Iraq. But they're okay with talking about colonization in Algeria, for instance, or the things that have happened in the past. So so they want to have some kind of distance, so to actually bring up the current events that are happening, the events that we must be a part of, we must engage actively to change its outcome. There is that hesitance to go there. So
go ahead.
And also, there has not been. I mean, academia is really based on the research that has been done historically, right? So the publication that have been written about certain wars or social events, and the WikiLeaks, of course, is a new phenomena. Nobody has written a book in academia, right? So there have not been enough literature about the organization. So obviously there is a limitation as to how we as young researchers coming into academia and then try to legitimize the knowledge about this organization. I mean, that has been extremely difficult.
Fascinating. And I assume that you're speaking not only amongst in terms of just general psychology and that type of academia, but specifically also within liberation psychology and peers that are interested in that area. They are also resistant to WikiLeaks being discussed. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes, some of them are. I would say that not many people know much about WikiLeaks, and especially, I mean, in recent years after the 2016 presidential election, I mean, everything have completely changed in the U.S. People who used to support Julian, I mean, they turned against him, and they think Julian is just a puppet for Putin or cost Trump presidency. So it became much more hostile environment now.
Yeah, it's really disgusting the way that Julian and WikiLeaks became unfashionable amongst polite society to talk about it after 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. And also, I think that among psychologists, I mean, there's a question of how is WikiLeaks related to psychology at all?
Yes.
WikiLeaks is a journalistic organization. It has nothing to do with psychology. So there's that criticism, I guess. Initially, when I wrote a dissertation about WikiLeaks, there was the kind of criticism that come from one of my professors, and he made sure that I'm not studying political science, or I'm not studying sociology. I'm studying psychology. So I had to really establish. I mean, so that was also challenging as well.
It's interesting, this term liberation psychology, obviously it came from liberation theology, is that right?
Yes, yes, and liberation psychology is one that was established by Ignacio Martin Barro, who lives in El Salvador, and he was actually assassinated by CIA-backed military, and by basically standing up for his own people. And he wanted to create a psychology that could apply to his people, not just to back off a little bit, to just give you the background of this story. Psychology as it exists currently is very Eurocentric. And then, so that this psychology that we understand or we learn in United States or in Europe, we have this model of humankind, in a model of man or individuality that is based on certain kind of psychological makeup that are very much Eurocentric, based on European culture. And it doesn't give a space for other ways of existence. So for instance, people in different cultures, they have a different conception of a man. For instance, in South Africa, there is the notion of Ubuntu, which is Ubuntu, which is the idea of individual being connected to other people. So it's not like a Western self-contained individualism, but it's more like I am part of you, I am because of you. There's that acknowledgement of interconnectedness. So they have that as a model of what it means to be human, which is different than European model of individualism. But there is no space for that. So that the Western psychology, psychology as it exists now, is basically it's like a form of hegemony. It's trying to make everybody conform to this European notion of man or manhood. So liberation psychology challenges that. And Ignacio Martin Barro wanted to create a psychology that actually frees its people, frees people of other cultures from this European imperialism, basically. So that's how it started. And I find what Julian has done with WikiLeaks is very much that. Very much support what, liberation psychology is trying to do, because he was trying to liberate people around the world, those who are oppressed, and trying to have them restore their own experience through showing the oppression that has been done to them and the history that has been stolen from them.
You talk about collective amnesia, and I find that an interesting term because I wonder how much of it is enforced on the population and how much is willingly participated in. People don't want to face who they are, obviously, if there's something really ugly in their behavior. You could talk about an individual who's in denial about doing things, or a whole society and a history of a society. So here's Assange, and I don't think he was very well liked even in 2006 with the collateral murder, let alone the mess of the election in 2016. So he was already, and that's what any good journalist or researcher does, and who has a big megaphone to try to make society realize you've got this problem, you got to correct it. Instead, what's the reaction been?
We humans are historical beings. We find our place through our understanding of history, what has taken place in the past. And then out of the knowledge, we create future. And the history has been stolen from us. And that's why, WikiLeaks, Julian cited Orwell's dictum, those who control the past control the future, So basically, and then the role of journalists, they are not just disseminating information that are happening now. They are supposed to also help us remember our history, and then claim our own past and history. So that's what WikiLeaks has done. And so the law images that have been revealed through the collateral matter video, we were able to see forgotten past, the past that we are not allowed to see, the past that have been altered. That's a significant moment that those who are willing to look at, we are able to remember something that's still deeply in our psyche. So that's why I think what Julian has done is very significant. And he changed the face of journalism, really. Journalism could go deeper. Journalists, their job is to restore history, and so that ordinary people can claim their own history and participate in history. And that's what WikiLeaks has done. And that's why I personally support WikiLeaks and what Julian has done. Because we haven't seen anything like this before. Nobody has done this.
No, absolutely. And I think that one of the things that really resonates with me when you're speaking about that is it's not just distant history. We've already talked about this to an extent, but that it was so recent that it was almost present compared with, exposing the transgressions of a government that was, that existed decades ago. And not only that, but when you say it changed journalism, I think, and I don't know if you agree with this or to what extent you agree with this, but it revealed what journalism was in comparison with what we always thought it was. It revealed how wrong the mainstream press had been. We assumed that it was as legitimate as what WikiLeaks showed us, but it took WikiLeaks showing us how wrong they were to realize that it had been a broken system all this time. And I don't know, and that reminds me of what you're saying about actually pushing back on a Eurocentric psychology by just saying, oh wait, no, you're not actually the entire representation of psychological existence that that we've always kind of just assumed that it was. But to what extent though do you think that regardless, like whatever happens with Assange moving forward, which I mean, it does not look good at all. I think we'd be deluding ourselves to say that this looks like anything other than an absolute, debacle and disaster of human rights and legal injustice. But moving forward, do you think there will come a point where either through your work and the work of others that psychology and academia in general will actually give a fair look at WikiLeaks? Or is it going to be decades down the line? How long do you think that's going to take, or will it happen at all? I guess is my question.
Well, I think that I personally think that the psychologist can play a very essential role in freeing Julian Assange, which is to, we are those who are trained to understand the psychological manipulation, in the domain of emotions and the impulses and unconscious, which are kind of hidden, which are used by the mainstream media to manipulate us and to engineer our consent. And so we were very much, able to see, we have eyes to see the psychological dimension. And we should use our expertise to actually dismantle this psychological manipulation and to let public know what's happening, which I think, the psychologist, clinical psychologist, Lissa Johnson does so well. And more of us, I think, need to do this work. And so it's not, from my perspective, it's not just information. There's something deeper that is involved, that creating this collective amnesia and also apathy and indifference, which is, for instance, even I think people get information, accurate information. There are some people who don't want to act, some people who cannot accept what is presented to them. And it's because there's some kind of blockages that prevent them from remembering, because there's something that is the domain of psychology, that we have to understand what makes it impossible for people to accept the reality. And good example of this, I find, is what's happening in the US political arena. I mean, every 4 years, American people come back to the electoral arena and engage in this ridiculous political game of lesser of the two evil. I mean, every 4 years. And then every time it gets worse and worse. And still they do it. I mean, they don't seem to learn from the history, or they don't seem to learn from what has happened in the past, right? And then no matter how much people inform American voters, there's still, they can't stop it. So that's one example of how everything is psychological. And then the information itself is not enough. And there have to be something more. And that is its essence, or that this critical ingredient, I would say, in my opinion, came from the WikiLeaks publication of the Colorado Matter video. That visceral image did something to us. It cuts through all the propaganda, all disinformation, and directly spoke to our heart. And then we remembered, because it's our heart that remembers. It's not our head that understands the information and try to analyze and try to see what is right. It's not. It's our heart. And so WikiLeaks provided a way to directly speak to the heart. And that's what, and that material came from Chosha Manning, came from her conscience. And that was not, how she made the decision was not an intellectual, analytical process. If that was an intellectual process, she would have shied away from it. She would not have taken that risk. That's a suicide. No, but she made that choice because her conscience said that's the right thing to do. And because she remembered our inherent obligation to one another. And she followed her heart, from my perspective. So we have to connect, I think, the American public, ordinary people around the world, to that conscience. And that's exactly what WikiLeaks done. And perhaps in the most beautiful way, through their publication of the Colorado Matter video.
Absolutely. And I think it's such an important point. As you say, it's the images that speak to us in a way that is non-intellectual, it's non-verbal, and in that way it's much, much deeper than, you know, the thousands and thousands and thousands of words that WikiLeaks has also published. In some ways, those images were so much more impactful.
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
Because I think that we intuitively know what is wrong. You know, and we don't have to be told how it's wrong. We know. And you know, it's the same thing about Assange, is what's happening to Assange. I mean, what has been done to Assange? We know that's wrong, you know, and we don't have to read all of those articles or get that information about what's happening to Julian. I mean, if we look at the physical deterioration and mental deterioration that he exhibited on Monday, we know there's something deeply wrong. And so that's, you know, but then there is that loud noise coming from the mainstream media that denies our intuitive knowing, denied what we know to be right. You know, so I think it's again, it's just we need to directly speak to ordinary people. I mean, just as fellow human beings, about what's happening to Julian and all whistleblowers. Then I think eventually we would understand. Eventually, public would understand, and then they would start trusting what they already know.
Stepping away just slightly from WikiLeaks, about basically comparing WikiLeaks in the way that it has acted to liberate us by giving us that truth that was hidden from us, compared with, for example, you know, do you have any perspective on the way that psychology, and I know that others have written about this quite a bit, but I wanted to ask you to speak on it, and that is the way that psychology has been used not only to, you know, basically keep us slaves to the status quo, but actively in order to find better ways of propagandizing us. And we see, you know, whether it's, you know, Lissa Johnson's pieces on that type of topic and the CIA advertising for psychologists, and that type of issue. I just wanted to ask you to kind of compare that with what WikiLeaks has done and contrast that to some extent.
I think knowledge is a power. And those of us who gain the knowledge, they have a choice. They have a choice to use the knowledge to control other people and gain power over them, or they, you know, use the knowledge to serve for other people, to help other people. And in my opinion, WikiLeaks, I mean, Julian Assange has done exactly, chose the path to use knowledge in service for others. And I think, you know, CIA, I mean, intelligence agency and US government, I mean, those who are inside, they chose to abuse that power. So that it's, to me, it became so much like obviously present the contrast between the two. And that's why we are now seeing this battle involving the First Amendment and with WikiLeaks at the front line of this battle. And I think, you know, and this is the choice that we all have to go through this, and we all have to make our own choice as to how we want to use knowledge. And I think Julian has made that choice. Churchill Manning made that choice. Edward Snowden made that choice. And all of us here made that choice. And people in academia, I mean, they have massive responsibility, in my opinion, because currently how the society is structured, they were placed in a position of power, and well, they're placed in a position of authority, so that they can abuse the authority, of course. So again, I think it's present these choices.
And speaking of those choices, how would you advise young prospective students, very young academics, making the choice to enter academia? How do you advise them in actively, I guess, going into it with the intention of making a difference and actively affecting change, not just to sit there and, you know, study academia for the sake of it and for the sake of career alone? Do you have any advice to people going in with that intention in mind?
For instance, I actually went into academia wanting to become a clinical psychologist. I mean, I had a whole intention to do the practicum and fulfill the internship hours and become professional. And I decided not to, because there was something more important that happened during the time that I was in academia. And I just simply followed my heart, simply followed what is important, what is right for me. And as a result, I mean, I learned more about history. I learned more about how the world works through WikiLeaks. And this was a tremendous, I mean, gave me tremendous knowledge and information, and that I would never have anywhere, or would not have anywhere in any kind of official learning environment, I guess. So, you know, I would tell young people, you know, universities and institutions are not the only place that you can learn. You know, if you want to learn, if you want to understand history, if you want to learn about the world, you know, engage actively in the world. And so that's maybe the advice I give to them. So, you know, and you can also learn psychology, you know, you can also learn politics. I mean, all those things. And just look at Julian as an example. I mean, he's incredibly brilliant. I mean, knowledgeable about everything, you know, almost. And he just learned by himself. I mean, through engaging in, you know, what he's passionate about, what he thinks important. So, yeah.
So basically, so what I'm taking away from your comments is the advice to, you know, whether we're prospective students, whether somebody is going to academia or any other venture, your advice in terms of activism or in terms of trying to really affect change rather than just study history or that type of thing, is to make the same type of moral and conscience-based judgment that Assange, Manning, Snowden, and others have made, even though we might not be in the positions that those people were. We might not face the same type of process. It's to follow this. Yeah.
And I give that advice more so based on the current economic, you know, configuration of you know, higher education. I mean, currently, I mean, at least in the US, when students want to learn and decide to go to university, they have to get into massive student debt, and that would unfree them, basically. That would make them be a slave, you know, and they become unfree, and they can't really act out of a conscience simply because they have to pay off the student loan, and that, you know, narrows down their choices in what they want to do for future. And so I say more so, you know, you don't have to go into debt. You can learn, you know, and you can be confident, and you can, you know, be knowledgeable about what's happening in the world.
You know, debt slavery is definitely the phrase that comes up when you describe that. And I know that so many young people are going through that type of decision-making process of whether it's worth it or not to take on that type of debt.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. No, and I go ahead, please.
Well, and then also that there is, one would recognize, I mean, when I entered into academia, of course, I was naive, you know, I didn't really understand how system works and stuff. I was honestly believing that academia is a place where, you know, people actually care about social justice, or, you know, there's a thing called academic freedom and all of that stuff, you know. And then how naive I was, you know, when I got in. That's not the case. I mean, there's this economic incentive that systematically make it difficult for us to speak truth, and actually research about things that challenge the current political, you know, structure of power, for instance. So, you know, so that's one actually piece of the truth I got out of entering into academia. And, you know, so for instance, in the US, anyone who speaks about, be critical about Israel, you know, what Israel is doing to Palestinians, for instance, then they might lose tenure. You know, they might be kicked out from their positions, and they lose jobs and things like that. So there is, you know, we have to understand there is this restriction and the systemic kind of indoctrination of making us be professional and, you know, making us conform to this dominant narrative. And we become very unconscious. I mean, we think that we're actually fighting for justice and all of that stuff, but, you know, we would be indoctrinated to the system.
That is such an important point, and it's something that we have not, as a discussion, especially relation to WikiLeaks, but in general, we don't have that discussion enough. We don't talk about the type of conformity in academia and in universities that happens that is just as, if not worse, than the type of conformity you see in journalism. I mean, we talk about the kind of co-opted narratives in journalism. We talk about propaganda in journalism, but we don't talk about propaganda in academia almost at all. It's just not a discussion that we have. So thank you for bringing that up. That's really important.
Right. And then I like to point out one other thing, which is, we have a DSM, basically the Psychological Diagnostic Manual, which has a certain definitions to label people, right? Diagnose people to have certain psychological disorders. And what was interesting is that there is new label created, which is called the what is it? Defiance, something about the people who defy authority. The people who challenge authority, and that's listed as a kind of a psychological disorder, and which is astonishing because then whistleblowers or someone like Julian Assange is easily labeled as somebody who has psychological issue,
pathologizing
it, yes. But then where does that criteria come from, right? That someone to say, which activities are ill, which are healthy, I mean, who make that examination? And that's, again, it's coming from the center of authority, that they are the one who say these activities are allowed, and then draw a line between what is healthy and what is pathology, basically.
It seems so insidious that we don't talk about that. We do talk about the FBI basically calling anyone who dissents a domestic terrorist. I mean, at least we talk about that being as awful as it is, but we just don't talk about what you've just brought up regarding the DSM and the pathologizing of dissent. That's incredible to me that it's just not a conversation we have. I think to some extent it speaks to the way that we still allow arbiters of truth. Like maybe we're starting to question the arbiters of truth in the news media, but we haven't really begun to do it in the realms of psychology and academia.
Well, anyone, I think, expert, anyone who are placed in the position of expert, basically, because they are the ones who are indoctrinated with orthodox knowledge, and then the orthodox knowledge is produced by those in power. They are the ones who basically, receive this dominant knowledge and then try to control and regulate other people's activities. This is done by journalists, of course. The journalists engage in perception management, and this is, of course, done by psychologists who pathologize people, and I mean, so everything is just and this leads to what Julian often talk about, the notion of illegitimate authority. Authority itself is fine, but we have to understand whether that authority is legitimate or not, and then decide whether we want to give somebody our authority or not. And we cannot be just blind, just trusting everyone, just because they're expert, just because they're professors, or just because they're policemen, or just because they're journalists working for New York Times,
No, I wanted to add that that's so brilliant in terms of seeing that WikiLeaks didn't just give us tools to criticize power in the media and in politics or the military. It gives us a tool to really criticize power in general. And maybe that's what's so revolutionary about WikiLeaks, and why it scares that embedded power structure so much, because it is so generalized.
Exactly. Well, WikiLeaks challenged the professional class, basically, because what WikiLeaks has done, I mean, I say this often and often, but I mean, WikiLeaks just didn't make journalism and just better or more effective. I mean, what WikiLeaks fundamentally has done is that WikiLeaks enabled the capacity for everyone around the world to perform the job that journalists used to do. So that WikiLeaks opened the door for citizen journalism, so that we can apply the First Amendment to ourselves and start to inform ourselves. That makes journalism basically obsolete. Like professional journalism, we don't need to have professional journalism to some degree, or like we would be able to challenge actually professional journalists, because they have to do way better job than citizen journalists for them to survive, right? So that's why journalists in Guardian or New York Times, they don't like Assange, because instinctively they know WikiLeaks has done fundamentally put them out of their business. So that's why they fight against, I mean, they smear Assange and all of that stuff.
Well, Nozomi, I just wanted to pursue this line with you about a culture that does not want to look at itself the way it really is, that denies certain really ugly features about it, and then ostracizes or destroys the few people within that culture who have the courage or determination to point out what's wrong. And I wanted to ask you, why are there so few people in a given culture that do that, that don't accept the group understanding of themselves? For example, American people don't want to see themselves as being a nation of aggressive war and exploitation of the planet, etc. They want to see themselves as defending democracy. So the leaders can get away with that very easily, this lie that we're spreading democracy, when anybody objectively sees that as not the case. So it's about how you feel about yourself. That's how easily it is for leaders to get away with that. And why are so few people in a culture able to step outside and say, wait a minute, that's rubbish?
Well, I think that people in America, I mean, we are grown up, most of us grown up with European dualistic morality, which creates a radical separation of evil and good. So that there is this, we have this mentality of this is good, this is evil, and that there's a clear line between the two. And our part of, I mean, from I don't want to get into the more, use the psychological jargons to explain this, but we have, I mean, psychology, we have understanding of ego. Ego is like our thinking, and it's how we identify ourselves, or the basis of our identity. And part of human nature is to project parts of ourselves that we don't want to look at, or we don't want to admit that belong to us. So that's why it's easy for us to actually, I mean, it's something that we always do, since we are young. I mean, we tend to like to think that we are good, right? So then neighbors or our friends, they are the bad ones. Or if we recognize that there is a certain unfavorable trait within us, it's hard for us to accept that they belong to us and take responsibility for it. I mean, that's just a part of human nature wherever we are, right? So that, and in our culture that is based on European Judeo-Christian religious dualistic morality, discourage us to actually acknowledge our shadow, acknowledge our darkness, and then instead makes us to project upon people overseas. And that's what media does. Media paints people overseas to be, they are the terrorists, they are the evil ones, and they are they want our freedom and all that stuff. And then we just fall for that, right? It's part of our kind of human nature. And that's why I remember Tricia Manning during court martial pointed out that the reason why she released the material that relate to Iraq war or Afghanistan, but that she wanted American public to know that not everyone is not everyone is like enemy. She wanted us to know who they really are. And not like the demonized people. I mean, they are just like us, right? So, and I think the question of your question about why there are people like Chosho or Julian who rise above this kind of conditioning and be able to stay true to our humanness, so to speak, to try to see try to understand each other, not just as our projection, but to let them reveal who they are. And I think the reason why they were able to do it is, I say they had, I think they had extraordinary empathy, I think. And also ability to be true to themselves. And which is, I think, their characteristics. I mean, that's why I think they are extraordinary people.
Well, I mean, yes, they are extraordinary people, but it's not just Julian. It's anyone who questions their own culture and steps outside. And that could be a lowly journalist or a website like Consortium News, for example. Not
right
in any way to put ourselves in the category of what Chelsea Manning or Julian Assange have done and what they're going through. But it's just so rare to see some people who are able to just look at ourselves and how we really are. And this becomes a very, very risky thing to do in terms of losing your job, for example, or whatnot, or losing friends. I cannot stand anymore to hear American people regurgitate these absolute cartoonish views of the world. And you mentioned the good and evil.
Yes,
this is a child's idea of the world and the way life is.
Right.
There's no gray area, right?
And that's, I mean, that's what we see so enacted in U.S., electoral arena. Every 4 years, the candidate come and then we project, and then Trump is the evil, Clinton is the evil, and then we both kind of project each other, right? And demonize each other and stuff, and then act out of these emotions. I mean, and in some ways, I think those who control us, they play with these low emotions that we have.
Yes. Well, that gets to the question. Yeah.
Exactly.
That gets to the question of how the people who control us, are they themselves victims of this self-delusion as well, or are they really clever, some of them, and know what they're doing? I think you have to go to each individual person to figure that out. The father of basically PR, the public relations or propaganda machine, is Edward Bernays. I mean, he studied from his uncle Freud, Sigmund Freud, and his understanding of the unconscious. So, and he found a way to manipulate people's emotions and create a projection and stuff, So we who don't understand, this psychological, how we work psychologically, I mean, we become extremely vulnerable. And that's what advertisement company do, right? We just buy things because our emotions and desires, they are played, they are exploited. And then now we have surveillance company, and they know more than that. There's a thing about the saying about everybody say that Google knows more about you than your mother, right? So it's like they understand our deepest desire, and they play with it, they exploit that. The advertising is really where it began in the public relations in the 1920s. That came out of the Creel Committee, which was Woodrow Wilson set up this committee to try to sell the war.
Exactly.
It worked so well that the private companies decided to create public relations departments, and then advertising came along, and people have been primed. And now advertising went back into politics in a big way when TV in the 1960s, the first debate, so that there's no distinction between advertising and political propaganda right now. I want to just, when you talk about projection, there's two examples that always get me. One was John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, actually made this statement regarding what he said was a Russian invasion of Ukraine, which there's no evidence for. There are already Russian troops in Ukraine. They're legally in the Crimean base. They left the base. There has never been tanks moving across the border. We know that General Breedlove, who was the head of NATO, lied. Der Spiegel did a report that he completely lied about 40,000 troops. There were no troops. And yet John Kerry stood up there and said, in the 21st century, nations don't invade other nations. And he voted for the Iraq invasion. Now, how could people not have seen that? He voted for the invasion of Iraq, which was a massive traditional military invasion of a sovereign nation, unprovoked, the supreme war crime, according to the Nuremberg protocols. And yet he can go out there and say that. And it was the same about the Russians getting involved in Syria. Putin made a big speech at the UN in September 2015 at the General Assembly. He invited the United States to join Russia the way the Soviet Union and America did to fight the Nazis, to fight ISIS. And these bloody jihadists who had become extremely powerful and had to be stopped. Of course, the Obama administration said no, and the reporting, I remember I was at Wall Street Journal then, and I got to see the other people's copy, and I didn't write that story, but I read where in the first paragraph, this was Russia reestablishing its imperial glory. They're accusing Russia of imperialism. And if I'm going to have an imperial adventure, I'm not inviting my enemy to take part in it. He invited the U.S. to join him. But see, Russia's the imperialist. Russia does the invasions. It's just, I'm sorry, I get infuriated by how the media lets them get away with this. For their own vanity, their own careers, whatever their motives are, they've lost the plot here. That's not what journalism is supposed to do. Supposed to be doing what we do here.
Yeah. And I think that part of projection is that we twist, we alter reality. I mean, it's you know, what I mean, to some degree, I think we like to think that they intentionally fabricate information or you know, alter reality. But I think they unconsciously do it because they don't want to see the reality. I mean, so in order to protect themselves from actually facing the reality, I mean, that's part of psychological defense mechanism, you know, and oftentimes, I mean, the good example of this, of course, is that, let's say, if a wife is trapped with, you know, violent husband, and you know, she knows that her husband is cheating on her, and she has all the evidence, right, that he is not faithful to her, and then all of that stuff. But she doesn't want to face the reality, doesn't want to actually find out and face the truth. So then all she does is that she make excuses, you know, she changes, she alter the fact and reality and minimize and all of that stuff, that in order to protect herself from facing the painful truth, right? Because once you find out the truth, you have to change, you have to act differently, right? So, I mean, it's something similar, in my opinion. So some people don't want to face, I mean, some people truly believe, I think many Americans believe that they are, you know, their country is the greatest one on this planet. I mean, they like to think that Americans are great people. They don't want to see that the, you know, US is invading those countries, the countries that have shown no threat to their own.
Or that we have no health care, no health and insurance system, and we're behind so many other countries.
Exactly.
We're still the best. We're still the best.
So that's why they want to attack Russia, for instance, you know, and they, you know, so that, or China saying they are bad, you know, they don't have free speech, or you know, they have dictatorship there. But in the US, we have democracy. In the US, we have free speech. You know, we have all glorious stuff. You know, we are very civilized. I mean, that's how we want to paint ourselves, right? And then so what WikiLeaks has done, I mean, what Julian has done is to shatter that illusion that we have. You know, that we have to face the reality that we are not greatest country on the planet, number one, and we don't have free speech. Number two, we don't have democracy. I mean, that's so painful for Americans to realize, and to know that their government have been lying to them, and their government have been corrupt.
You know what's interesting?
It's hard.
Nozomi, you talk about the individualism of the West as opposed to other cultures, and yet it's the lack of individualism that allows this tribal mentality that we're the best, we're right, you can't criticize us. So this is a different kind of individualism that somebody like Chelsea Manning or Julian Assange is displaying. This is real individualism, to go against your group, to endanger your own future by doing that because you want to help the group. And the group, rather than showing, they show the individualism, I can make more money than you can. Right. My car is bigger than yours. That's the kind of individualism we have in the West. Not the serious one that we need. That's tribal then.
Exactly. It's very much tribe. I mean, you're right, Joe. And I think that this identity tied to nation state, that's what we have, so that we think that we are American, we think we are, you know, Japanese or French, or, you know, so that anything that, you know, that we cannot think of ourselves as global citizen. And I think Chelsea and Julian, I mean, they, I think, look at themselves as a, you know, just a human being and who lives on this planet. That's why their compassion extend. I mean, it goes beyond the borders. Why on the earth do you think that Julian, who is a Australian citizen, would actually do things, help American whistleblower? I mean, because or care about people in Tunisia, or care about people in care about Catalonian people, because he simply is concerned about the well-being of all humanity, all people, and that makes them different, right? I mean, so that we, and then I think those of us who are able to look at ourselves as global citizens, who are in touch with our own humanity, we don't fall into this nationalistic propaganda. We don't, we will examine fact. We are open to examine fact and look at information, instead of just falling into this tribe mentality and quickly make a judgment saying, oh, Russia is trying to attack us, or, you know what I mean? So yeah, it's a nationalism. It's the collectivism. That
to be fair, though, I think all societies have this function.
Yeah, exactly.
Just that America is the most powerful, so it's the most dangerous. But right. Even you're in Japan. Japan's pretty conservative, right? It's not easy to step outside and criticize the Japanese nation, is it?
Of course. I mean, the same. And then, what happened during, before World War II. I mean, if you remember, I mean, we had this fanaticism, right? Japanese version of Manifest Destiny, that we are the one, God-chosen nation that is supposed to conquer the whole entire Asia. And so Japan was an empire, in the East. So, we all have this kind of psychological vulnerability to fall into this collectivism, and that creates a massive, psychosis. Then once this is activated, then nothing would get through, because we lose our ability to think critically.
And only a few individuals with empathy and courage, is basically what you're saying, can risk their futures by speaking out against this. Just aren't enough. They just aren't enough.
Those of us who are still in touch with our own humanity, who remember who we are, we are not just, I'm not just Japanese or American. I am human being foremost. And, and in this, we live in this nation state paradigm where we are constantly given a message that, we are Americans, we are Japanese, or, we have to fight against each other, That's why we can't solve issues like climate change that impact all of us, right? Because we are always divided into nations and things and try to compete against each other, But once we recognize and awaken our own humanity, we realize that issues that we face we share the same issues, right? So I think that it's important for us to remember who we are, and that's the key. And that's the awakening is actually, that was demonstrated by individuals like Julian and Chelsea.
Elizabeth, back to you.
Yeah, I just have one last question. Listening to you both has brought up, just reminded me of something that Carl Jung said, and educate me if I'm misquoting him. But I believe that he said something along the lines of enlightenment not coming from imagining figures of light, but coming from making the darkness conscious. And I think that ties so directly to WikiLeaks and making the shadow of the US imperialism conscious. And I just wanted to state that and get your thoughts on it before we ended the interview.
I love that quote. It's so true. I think, it's if we can own our own shadow and darkness, no matter how painful it is, that's the only way that we can actually achieve enlightenment. And, we have not been civilized. That's what it is. I think one of the greatest, significance of WikiLeaks is WikiLeaks has shown us, where Western civilization is currently. Have we, civilized yet? And we have to ask ourselves that question and answer that. And I think the civilized nation would not engage in illegal wars, not engage in, exploitation of other nations. Civilized nations would function with the principle of law. The civilized nation. I mean, if Western civilization is truly civilized, we would not be seeing what's happening to Julian Assange right now. Exactly. I mean, here, this journalist, greatest journalist of our century, has been imprisoned for practicing journalism. And he has been put into solitary confinement.
Right.
And so this is, are we really civil? No. If we are civil and truly enlightened, that's not happening. And we have to actually really look into this and ask ourselves questions. And for that, it's painful, but we have to recognize and we have to look at our own shadow and darkness. And that's happening, right before our eyes with Julian Assange's extradition case.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say, is that he's continuing to do that so far beyond just what WikiLeaks has published. Right now, he's still showing that shadow to us.
Exactly. And then he's punished, he's attacked because he let us see the darkness, let us see the shadow of Western civilization. And that's why he's just made into an enemy. But this is the way this is the only way that we would actually achieve civilization. We would achieve enlightenment, is to get through, to own our shadow and darkness.
Well, those are excellent words to end this with. I'm thinking of a prehistoric tribe where there is a deluded belief in certain God, and then one person steps out and tries to alert the group that they're headed towards disaster if they go on that course. And instead of listening to that person, they send them off into the forest.
Exactly.
That's what we've got here. Assange and Manning and other whistleblowers were trying to help a group that's going off the cliff to stop that behavior, and instead they won't listen to them. They punish them, and that's the future we may be looking at. Nozomi, thank you so much.
To say one thing, that in my eyes, Julian Assange is the imprisoned light of Western civilization, and we have to free him in order for us to be civilized and enlightened.
Well, they can't say they weren't warned when things go off the rails here in our society as we continue with this delusional grab of power and violence around the world. Thank you, Nozomi, for joining us from San Francisco area. Really hope to have you back on again. It's terrific.
Thank you for coming on.
It's my pleasure.
We're joined now by Australian clinical psychologist Lissa Johnson, who has been kind enough to come on and speak to us about Monday's events, and also some of her thoughts that she has penned so very wonderfully on throughout the summer, throughout the year, on the psychology of getting Assange, and specifically also torture and solitary confinement. Lissa, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the first things I wanted to ask you about was this discussion that a lot of people have been having, especially in reaction to Monday's events, that centers around whether or not Assange has been drugged or is being drugged, and that might be producing some of the effects that we saw in court on Monday. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is it exclusively drugs, or are there other reasons that we could see, Assange in the state that he was in?
Well, it's perfectly possible that he's being medicated, but the way Julian Assange presented in court on Monday, saying that he couldn't think properly, having difficulty answering simple questions, feeling confused, and all of that is entirely consistent with having been held in prolonged solitary confinement. So in fact, it's predictable. And to me, when I watched and read about Monday's proceedings, what jumped out at me was that it was a really alarming snapshot of what Niels Meltz has been warning us about for months, that Julian Assange has been showing symptoms typical for somebody who suffered a prolonged period of psychological torture. And there were aspects of solitary confinement in the Ecuadorian embassy for years, and sensory deprivation. And in Belmarsh prison, that's been intensified to an extreme degree, that he's held in maximum security lockdown. And there's a solid literature on the effects of solitary confinement and sensory deprivation on people. And what it does, of course it causes distress, and I think people misunderstand how severe it is and what it does to people. So it doesn't just cause distress, it doesn't just cause loneliness, depression, boredom, learned helplessness. It does cause those things along with very serious psychiatric and psychological disturbances. But it also, in addition to that, causes severe cognitive and mental impairments and deterioration such that people, brain activity is reduced in solitary confinement. And after just 7 days, that reduced brain activity can become permanent. In studies of people who've been held in solitary confinement, the cognitive changes, so memory impairments, concentration impairments, information processing impairments, so that, people can't follow a logical thought, they can't create a coherent logical stream of thought. If you can't remember what you just said or what you just read, you can't read, you can't follow what you're reading, you can't follow what other people are saying. That's what solitary confinement and sensory deprivation and lack of stimulation does to people. In studies of people who've been held in solitary confinement for a prolonged period, as Julian Assange has, show those effects still, an array of effects for decades after the person has been released from solitary confinement. So it's really not an exaggeration to say that solitary confinement and a lack of stimulation attacks the brain, and I don't think people appreciate that. The UN defines solitary confinement that lasts for more than 15 days as torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. And there's a reason for that. It's because of these long-term serious adverse effects that it has. So, the way Julian Assange presented on Monday, there's no need to speculate. I mean, perhaps there's medication, but there's no need to speculate that to explain what we saw. I think one of the reasons people don't appreciate how serious solitary confinement is that you can't see it and you can't see the effect of it. And the reality is that opportunities for meaningful social interaction and sensory stimulation and mental stimulation aren't just nice to have; they're necessary minimum conditions for human functioning. So depriving people of that is like depriving people of food and water. Just as the body wastes away, breaks down, degenerates without food and water, the mind, the brain, its functioning degenerates and breaks down without opportunities for social interaction, stimulation. There's absolutely no reason for Julian Assange to be in maximum security lockdown. There's no rationale. There's no charge in the UK. There's no sentence. The only purpose it serves is to inflict the kind of damage that I'm talking about. It's expecting him to go to court after months of solitary confinement, not having been able to read. The not reading doesn't just rob him of the opportunity to prepare his defence. It's adding to that sensory deprivation, lack of stimulation, and the damage that causes to the brain. So it's like expecting somebody to go perform in the Olympics after you've held them immobilised, deprived of food and water for months. Expecting him to go to court and fight these extradition charges after months of solitary confinement, is the psychological, mental, cognitive equivalent of that. So, Nils Meltzer has been warning us, and he's up against the fact that journalists, politicians, just from observing the reaction, don't understand the seriousness and the reality of psychological torture and the flow-on implications here for rule of law, for the right to a fair trial, due process, are quite profound. And I think there's two precedents being set. One's the extradition precedent, which the media and increasingly human rights organisations and legal organisations are alert to. That sets a dangerous precedent for all sorts of things, US asserting its jurisdiction across the world, media freedoms. There's also a torture precedent being set, which has its own chilling effect and its own devastating implications for rule of law, the right to a fair trial, democracy, human rights. And I think that second precedent's been grossly underappreciated in the media. Anybody watching this in a position of influence over public opinion, any editors, any journalists, any politicians, need to really educate yourself about psychological torture, solitary confinement, and start amplifying what Nils Meltzer, the UN Rapporteur on Torture, has been saying. It's very important and it's very serious. And we saw that on Monday.
Yeah, to echo those thoughts, I mean, I just want to emphasize as well that it is not over dramatizing the situation to state that Assange is being tortured. As you mentioned, Nils Melzer, we already have a very authoritative voice stating months ago that he has been and is being tortured. I don't have anything to add to that, but yeah, it's definitely not hysteria to state that.
Not at all. No. And as I say, this was foreseeable. Julian Assange's presentation on Monday. And, you know, Nils Meltzer's report wasn't just based on his opinion, it was based on the Istanbul Protocol, an accepted protocol for assessing victims of torture, the opinion of a medical and psychiatric expert with extensive experience assessing victims of torture. So, you know, they're the world's leading authorities on torture. We need to take it seriously. We need to, you know, the fact that people are speculating drugs just speaks to how real, you know, the impact of solitary confinement and psychological torture is. It's similar. You know, drugs affect the brain, they impair the brain. So does psychological torture. So, you know, it makes sense that people who don't understand what psychological torture does to people would be speculating that, because there's not good public awareness. You know, so actually there's an excellent article, an academic paper on the effects of solitary confinement called Banning the Bing. And people can just go to Google Scholar, type in solitary confinement, banning the Bing, and it will come up. You can read the PDF. So I encourage anybody in any position of authority or influence, and just anybody, you know, who's got friends to talk to raise awareness, to read that paper. Don't just take my word for it. Don't just take Nils Meltzer's word for it and his assessment team's word for it. Read that paper for yourself. Get familiar with the evidence about solitary confinement and draw the links between that and what we saw on Monday in court. And the links between that and the fact that the authorities holding Julian Assange in maximum security lockdown, in isolation, in understimulation, that they're aware of this literature. They know what they're doing. That there is a reason that people are put into solitary confinement, and it's because, you know, it immobilises and incapacitates them.
Yeah, it's called no-touch torture for a reason. Absolutely, you're saying. And I think that obviously we can't rule out any type of medication being used, but it's just that it's not necessary from what you're saying to explain that behaviour. Go ahead.
That's right. And even if he's being medicated, just the fact that he's been held in maximum security lockdown for all these months, those effects will be happening. I mean, that's what happens to any human being in those conditions, no matter how resilient, no matter how high functioning they were before, just by virtue of being a human being. Just like no matter how fit we are physically, everyone needs food and water, everyone needs to move their body to be healthy. Everybody needs social interaction and mental stimulation for their brain to keep functioning properly. So even if he's being drugged, it doesn't detract from the fact that all of that harm will be happening as well.
Before I hand it over to Joe, I'd like to ask one last thing, which is how, you know, recognizing all of that, recognizing the profound degree to which he's clearly been affected by the treatment he's received, how dangerous a situation do you think he is in I mean, we know that he's obviously not your patient, you have not been able to see him in person, but in asking you to speculate a little bit, do you have any insight in how dangerous a situation, precarious a situation health-wise he might be in right now?
I think it's devastatingly serious and risky in terms of his life. I mean, what I'm going on is Nils Meltzer said that, and, you know, he had a medical and psychiatric expert assess Julian Assange months ago. So if months ago they were saying, look, he could die in UK prison as a result of the conditions he's being subjected to, now we're months later. Physically, he looked like he'd aged a lot in a short space of time, and his friends were saying that. That's a very bad sign, because, you know, psychological torture also has physical health impacts, which I should have talked about, along with the impacts on the brain. You know, prolonged elevation of cortisol, a stress hormone, which happens in psychological torture. It affects the immune system, cardiovascular system can be affected. People are susceptible to all sorts of very serious illnesses. And, you know, the body starts breaking down as well, just as a result of the stress of prolonged psychological torture. So, and the other thing to go on is people who know him and who've known him well, some of them for a long time, like John Pilger, his father, John Shipton, Craig Murray, have all said that they're very concerned that he may die in prison because of the changes that they're seeing in him, physical and mental and psychological. So it seems to be apparent to people who know him well that this is a very rapid, very alarming degeneration, which is consistent with what Niels Meltzer and his team warned about months ago. And, you know, I mean, John Pilger all throughout the years has been, you know, emphasising Julian Assange's resilience and his fighting spirit. Most people have. Now that they aren't saying that. The people who know him well are saying, actually, we're really alarmed, we're really concerned. And I think Craig Murray said that before he'd been sceptical as to whether Julian Assange really was showing signs of somebody who'd been subjected to prolonged psychological torture. And Craig Murray has seen people in his job as an ambassador, you know, who've been subjected to torture. And he said what he saw in court on Monday convinced him that, yes, he is showing symptoms consistent with that. And so we need to take all of those warnings extremely seriously. And so that's another precedent. I mean, the torture precedent could go one of two ways. One is it seriously impairs Julian Assange's ability to fight these extradition, the extradition and the charges in the US. Well, that impairs all of our ability to fight the precedents that sets. We're relying on Julian Assange and his lawyers to fight that, to save us from criminalisation of journalism and the US being able to assert its jurisdiction all over the world. So that's one precedent that could be set. The other is if he dies in UK prison, that means he's been tortured to death. And we've been warned, and if we sit silently and watch that happen, if he does die in UK prison, you can't go back from that. Then we're a society that tortures its journalists to death for publishing, because every other pretext for holding him in Belmarsh has fallen away now. It's just about the reporting on, you know, war crimes in 2010. So people need to really think carefully about that as they sit silently while this happens. You know, and you're talking about before, it's not over dramatic to say he's being psychologically tortured. I mean, to be honest, I don't think this is over dramatic. I feel like we're sitting in the Colosseum in Rome, watching someone being fed to the lions blindfolded with their hands tied behind their back. You know, and people were fed to lions in the Colosseum for refusing to pledge their allegiance to the rulers of the day. That's what's happening here to Julian Assange. And so are we happy to sit there silently watching it happen, knowing that this is a litmus test? Someone else could be next. You know, if this is allowed to happen, we better all pledge our allegiance to the leaders of the day, or, you know, or suffer the consequences.
Well, to echo that, I think Pilger spoke on, I believe it was RT, about having felt that while on Thursday the week before he had visited Assange and he seemed to be in kind of fighting spirits, he said that he saw, you know, Assange on Monday in the courtroom and that it seemed his spirit had, quote, departed. I think you just cannot, I mean, that language from somebody like John Pilger, who's been so close to Assange all this time, is extremely, you know, shocking.
It is extremely shocking, yeah. And when he saw him on Thursday, the situation has different demands. Talking to an old friend who you're happy to see, you know, something that he's been deprived of would be craving. It's very different from being in court. Your life and your future hangs on this. You need to focus. You need to, you know, engage in complex arguments. You're under stress. You know, it makes sense that the functioning would be different in those two situations.
Well, your analogy of the Colosseum, it becomes replete with a braying, crazed crowd that's cheering on this torture of this person. And that includes, of course, the mainstream media. And a large part of the public who have either no interest, no knowledge, or misinformation about what this case is about. So it's scary, but we've got a declining empire, so we've got something similar. It's a very good analogy. You know, I was thinking when you were talking about the what it's like to be in isolation, just think, many of us, certainly I have, I work at home sometimes, and like 2 or 3 days could go by where I don't even go out. If I've got enough food in the fridge, I start to feel very disoriented after 3 days. I have to go out and have a connection with somebody, even if it's just to go down to the shop or something. Because if you don't have a connection with another person, you start feeling weird after just 3 days. I do. So if you can imagine now what he is, and it's really began when the Ecuador embassy shut down his internet access to the world. It was when really you could say that his isolation, it was already tough being indoors, but he had lots of visitors. When that that's more than 1.5 years now.
Exactly. That's right.
Now, now you talked about permanent damage. That's what I want to ask you about, because I think I remember Dan Ellsberg saying that Vanunu I'm forgetting his first name right now, the guy who revealed to the public the fact that Israel has a nuclear weapons program. He, of course, was lured into a honey trap in Rome and then put on a boat and sent back to Israel, and he spent more than a decade in solitary confinement.
Oh my gosh.
And I think Dan Ellsberg said that it took him a decade to more or less come back to normal. So I just wanted you to talk to me a little bit if you know about that. Is it permanent? Can it be reversed? And
it depends on the person. Like most things to do with the brain and psychological functioning and mental functioning, and there's wide variation between individuals. So, and we don't know, we can't predict who and why, you know, and when it will be permanent or recover. I mean, one thing in general with impairment to the brain, they talk about pre-morbid functioning. So it's a bit like a physical analogy would be if you're very fit and very strong before you have an injury, you probably recover better than if you weren't very fit and very strong. Same with the brain. If you've got a very strong, very agile, very adaptable, very powerful brain, you're more likely to recover from any kind of injury, so including from solitary confinement. So on those grounds, Julian Assange would have an excellent chance of recovering, but it could take a long time. And that's just, you know, the mental function, the cognitive function, you know, setting aside the trauma, the psychological suffering, the social impact, you know, there's a raft.
That's also presuming he will go free, because what you described before was, in very clear terms, he's being punished before conviction, before trial.
Yes. Yeah.
He is being punished already. They have decided he's guilty, and they're punishing him now.
Very severely, yeah, in a way that violates Convention Against Torture and, you know, all of his human and legal rights. In a very severe, actually violent way. You know, it's the no-touch torture. It's still violence. It's violence against his, you know, against his mind, against his brain, against his functioning as a human being. So, and you know, we've talked about this before on CN Live, that's collective violence because it's a group of states, the media, society, the judiciary perpetrating that, and so it means that none of us are just bystanders, or if we're bystanders, we're part of it, because collective violence is a group activity and it relies on silent, passive bystanders, like people sitting in the Colosseum just watching, maybe clapping politely because you like to do what the authorities tell you to do. So everybody really needs to think where they want to stand on this. And you know, I think if most people understood the impact of solitary confinement, understood the legalities surrounding what's happening, understood the precedents that are being set. You know, Julian Assange's case is a litmus test for a bunch of democratic rights and freedoms that are under serious attack in Australia. It probably seems more realistic to us in Australia that this is about a serious erosion of free press, because we're quite far along that path here, legally anyway. So, you know, people aren't well informed on that, and that's not their fault. And, you know, but I encourage people to try and get well informed on that. I mean, most people watching CN Live will be well informed on the legal and human rights context, but, you know, maybe add to that some understanding of the impact of solitary confinement and psychological torture. And, you know, people who are in a position to influence others or help other people to know and understand what's going on really need to pull their finger out, because good luck looking yourself in the mirror if you don't. If you're an editor or a journalist who has some autonomy and you're staying silent about this. And I know that sounds harsh, and normally psychologists aren't harsh with people, but there are times when there are threats on the horizon and people need a metaphorical reality slap. And, you know, this is one of those times.
To ask you one more question about, are there stages that a prisoner goes through in isolation that you could recognize, or are they different from one prison to the next? Have you seen any deterioration? And what could the end game be? Could someone just really go to a vegetative state if they're in solitary?
It's one of those things that varies very, very widely between people. Some people will start hallucinating within a day. Other people won't hallucinate at all. Some people will become catatonic and stare at the wall. Some people won't. Some people will start self-harming quite early in the process. Some people won't. So it's the way human beings are, basically. You know, if you get 100 people in a room, you'll have 100 different reactions often to the same experience or a similar experience. So tortures like that, there's not a series of stages people go through, other than really the reduction in brain activity. I mean, that's pretty much universal. And the trouble with that is you can't see it from the outside. If someone's hitting their head against the wall, you can see that. If they're catatonic, you can see that. If they're hallucinating, you can see that. You can't see from until it's quite progressed. You can't see it. I mean, we saw it on Monday because there's, as you say, Joe, about 1.5 years of essential solitary confinement gone into this, as well as years of the sensory deprivation, lack of sunlight, and the lack of stimulation. You know, when you talked about being in a room for a few days and you feel disoriented, you need to go out and have a walk. It's partly the social aspect. It's also partly just you're in the same environment, your brain's just responding to the same four walls, nothing's moving. We need more stimulation than that for our nervous system to keep firing normally, basically.
I believe
it's another reason you need to go out and have a walk. So yeah, that stuff's sort of kind of universal. The brain needs that, just like everybody's body needs food and water. But the precise ways, you know, if someone's physical health is affected, some people might get, you know, might affect their stomach, might give them headaches, or might give them, you know, similar psychologically. The precise manifestations differ, but you know, it's the reduced brain activities and so associated mental cognitive impairments is one thing that everybody experiences.
So the common denominator, with what Joe was asking, the common denominator, rather than there being set stages, would be that there is a profound effect at,
yes,
at relatively
exactly
quickly. Okay.
Yeah, and that, I mean, the UN's time frame is 15 days, which in a way is conservative. We know that after 7 days for some people the changes are permanent. So anything after 15 days is dangerous, and well, 7 days, you know, it shouldn't happen at all. But there's a reason people might think, oh, 2 weeks, that's a bit, you know, it's a bit soft. It's not. You know, the UN knows what it's talking about. There's a reason it says more than 2 weeks of solitary confinement is torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment.
And to give some context as well, I know that there are some medical documents that WikiLeaks has published that I believe were penned by a dentist and a doctor that saw Assange, I believe a psychologist, and they were published in 2015, so long before this 1.5 years of solitary confinement, and he was already suffering the effects of this. He was already suffering, as you mentioned, the lack of like depth perception change, lack of distances and changing environment was already affecting his eyesight. So there are these really concrete effects that aren't even psychological in terms of, you know, feeling and cognition, but physicality.
Yes,
that were already happening in 2015. So just
that's right.
Context for people that don't.
Yeah, that's right. So we can't say we weren't warned. You know, we've been warned by people who know what they're talking about for years now. So it's really time. Independent media is doing a brilliant job. It's really time for establishment media to pull their finger out and realise, you know, it's good that there's been more reporting against the extradition. Of course, that's really important, but that's not the only thing. People that, you know, the establishment media needs to stop being silent on the torture issue and on the reports and the warnings that are being issued about that. But, you know, I think that's an equally dire precedent that's being set.
Well, if it wasn't for that Ruptley cameraman running up to the vehicle Assange was in, we wouldn't have a single image of him.
Yes.
You know, and I thought, looking at some of the court drawings that were done, it was almost generous the way they'd kind of filled out his cheeks a little bit compared to how he looked in that van. I thought that was really striking.
That's a good point. Yeah, which is subtle censorship, isn't it?
Lissa, since you're in Australia, can you bring us up to speed on this quite interesting development in Parliament where Andrew Wilkie, an MP who was himself a whistleblower, has actually gotten this committee together, I think of 10 or more MPs, to make a presentation or a demand of the Prime Minister to intervene in this case. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, yeah, which is brilliant. I mean, that's the one, you know, ray of hope at the moment, with respect to Julian Assange's case and situation. So there's, I mean, last I looked at, 11 parliamentarians in Australia across the political spectrum who've come together to form a task force to work for the Australian government to bring Julian Assange to Australia, which is perfect. You know, I mean, there's arguments that Julian Assange isn't safe in Australia, but he's certainly not safe in the UK or in the US. It seems to be, I mean, the best option, especially if there are parliamentarians overseeing it and organising it. So they've issued some brilliant statements. Andrew Wilkie said after Monday's, court proceedings that it was clear that authorities were seeking to break Julian Assange, and they've almost succeeded. So he's not shying away from telling it like it is. So, there's been some decent mainstream media reports in Australia since Andrew Wilkie brought that task force together, which is heartening. Again, sort of across the political spectrum in the media. I hope that continues. And so anybody all over the world who wants to do something, wants to assist, getting behind this task force of the 11 Australian MPs, I think is really critical, because, the more force they have behind them, the more likely they are to be successful. And there's some very experienced, depending on which side of politics you're on, but well-regarded politicians. It's not just people on the fringes and the margins coming together to do this. And the fact that, it's rare that you see politicians across the political spectrum really joining forces on an issue. And I think the thing that unites them is they all understand the very dire implications this has for democracy and for press freedom and for rule of law. And I think they all care more about that, it sounds like, or they care about that as much as their party affiliation, which is what is required. So that's very heartening to see. And that's one hopeful thing. And good on them. Brilliant.
That is really important. Yeah. It goes across party lines. Yes. I saw Wilkie on one of the shows, Australian TV show, Sunday, and he had some extraordinarily good things to say about Australia's relationship with the US, which is at the heart of this, of course. Which he said maybe Australia ought to say no once in a while.
Yes.
Because the United States is taking Australia for granted. And the fact that Scott Morrison has supposedly a friendship with Donald Trump, which is too weird to even contemplate that, but it could work, in Assange's favor if the guy had the guts to take advantage of that relationship.
Yes.
Say, look, this is our citizen, bring him back, we want him back, Or we're not going to agree on this or that. Just cause a rupture in the relationship. But right now, he says, Andrew Wilkie said, Scott Morrison is not the vice president of the United States. Then he added, I hope. I hope.
That's a very good point, yes. Yeah, and Andrew Wilkie knows politics. I mean, someone like me, I don't, haven't been on that side of things, don't know how things really work, but Andrew Wilkie does. I'm sure he knows what he's talking about when he says that. And, psychologically, just in terms of people's relationships with each other, I mean, often people who are, can mistreat people and be a little bit of a bully, will respect people who stand up to them. So, you can do yourself damage by giving in too much to someone who's trying to push you around. So that's, just in terms of interpersonal dynamics, that's a really good point that he makes. He's saying some fabulous things. I mean, it's great that he's leading this task force, and I really encourage anybody in Australia to write to your MP, write to your newspaper, write to your, anybody you can think of to write to and call to get behind this task force and to demand that the Australian government listen to these 11 parliamentarians and stand up for our sovereignty, our fellow citizen, our civil rights, our democratic rights.
Well, the full statement from Wilkie from that TV show is on Consortium News. Anybody wants to see it. It was just I transcribed and put the entire thing in there because I thought it was such an important, beyond Assange, just the relationship between a satellite like Australia and the US and how damaging that can be on so many different levels. Well, Elizabeth, if you have any more questions, we could.
I have one last one. This
yes, please.
Statement. I just want to, as a for a final time, just reiterate that basically from returning back to your metaphorical comparison with the Colosseum and Rome and people being blindfolded and thrown to the lions. I just wanted to have your comment on spelling out that when somebody says, whether they're tweeting it, whether they're writing it in an article or just stating it in a conversation with friends, when we say that Assange is being assassinated before our eyes, we're watching it happen in real time. Would you say that's an accurate assessment, even if there are no drugs involved whatsoever and it's only solitary confinement that we're talking about?
Yes, it is accurate. I tweeted that out after Monday that Julian Assange's mother, Christine, wasn't exaggerating when she said quite a while back that her son's suffering a slow and cruel assassination before our eyes. It's exactly what we're watching. So, everybody needs to really open their eyes to that. It's hard to open your eyes to that. It's difficult to believe. It's more believable in Australia, where we're in what Andrew Wilkie calls a pre-police state here. And it's a very ugly reality to open your eyes to, but it's important. I mean, we're being warned all over the place from all kinds of people close to Julian, independent experts, seeing it for our own eyes in court. It's not an exaggeration at all. No.
Well, it's great to get your perspective on that. Thank you for confirming that. I think that's really helpful for me, and I hope it's helpful for our audience as well to hear that from your perspective as a professional.
I hope so too.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for joining us and giving me my social interaction today. It was the first I've had.
Get
and I
up and
thank
go for a
Elizabeth
walk,
for
Joe.
that too. Feel a little better right now, but
Good.
not about Julian Assange, of course. So thanks
No.
again, Lisa.
No.
Thanks again for joining us.
Okay, thank you both.
Thank you.
Well, Elizabeth, that's another show of CN Live. That was episode 15. We want to thank Nozomi, Hayase, and Lissa Johnson, and Patrick Henningsen, all of whom joined us to talk about the situation with Julian Assange. And we especially want to thank John Pilger for that tremendously powerful statement that he wrote for us for our show, because he couldn't join us tonight. So, Elizabeth, it's been a long week, and we'll look forward to next week's show, episode 16. Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Get out your notebook.